I would say there's definite interest across the cultural heritage sector for this new technology. I think, you can see quite clearly how Gaussian splatting can be used to capture almost anything.
And that was Thomas Flynn, a UK-based digital heritage expert specializing in 3D digitization, online publishing, open access storytelling, and interoperability. He has worked with UNESCO, Europeana, Oxford University, Creative Commons, and led cultural heritage at Sketchfab, where he launched the British Museum's first public online collection of open access 3D scans. In this conversation, we talk about the many ways museums could use 3D in their operation and beyond pure preservation.
3D is a very versatile medium, all the different ways that it could be helping people be educated using the collection, you make money for the organization.
What are the implications for even generating this type of data, and why Sketchfab is not a solution?
People are producing huge amounts of data, but there's no reliable long-term way to storing the data, and then can it be used and exploited. Sketchfab is a wonderful platform, but it's not where you put your data for long-term sustainable access.
What are his personal recommendations when it comes to experiencing cultural heritage in VR?
I've got a Quest 3 myself. I've had loads of great experiences with cultural content. I love the concept of web VR or web XR, that you can just reach a library of experiences via the web. There are some really nice demos online. There's a really old demo from Mozilla actually, which is kind of a playground.
And what happens when generative AI collides with cultural heritage?
Now you can just type in and say, give me a 3D model. How is that data being flagged, labeled, managed? What is truth? What is made up?
But before we get into it, I wanted to remind you that if you don't have the time to watch the full interview and want to learn from other founders and creatives at the intersection between XR and AI, you should definitely check out the XR AI Spotlight newsletter. By subscribing, you will get weekly interviews like this directly in your inbox and access to a list of tools and apps that allow you to experience Gaussian splatting in VR, on Quest, and Vision Pro. Just check the first link in the show description.
And now it's time to roll the title and welcome Thomas under the spotlight. Thomas, it is a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Gabriel. Great to be here.
So I reached out to you because there is a lot of buzz around Gaussian splatting now that everybody is capable of capturing close to anything. And I'm curious to talk and ask you, how do you see Gaussian splatting right now influencing the capturing process?
Well, I would say there's definite interest across the cultural heritage sector for this new technology. I think, you can see quite clearly how Gaussian splatting can be used to capture almost anything, and in really high fidelity, and also to capture aspects of a subject that traditional photogrammetry or other techniques maybe find a bit tricky. So there's definite interest, but it's also worth kind of putting that in the context that 3D for heritage organizations it's not really a core part of every organization's activities. So even now, 3D is a peripheral activity in many organizations. That said, it's a great, as I say, great technology, Gaussian splatting for capturing certain things in certain ways. But then some aspects, maybe it's less measurable as a format, less editable in the same way that geometric 3D models are. But no doubt that will change. It's been only a matter of years for this new technique to develop.
And do you see, let's say, that making a difference in a sense? So do you see actually some project popping up or something moving in a direction where we're saying, okay, now we are going to use Gaussian splatting instead of standard photogrammetry or maybe LiDAR workflows? Where do you see that being applied currently, or at least investigated, if not applied?
Yeah, well, I think exactly that each technology has kind of its own affordances that you can be used for certain things. So for LiDAR scanning is heavily used in building information modeling, and there's something called heritage building information modeling, where you want to capture a record of a building for conservation purposes, or maybe it's also objects and other subjects. And then photogrammetry, maybe you're capturing data that you want to put into some kind of interactive experience. So the kind of, I suppose, legacy 3D workflows across film, TV, video games, they're set up for mostly set up for meshes. Although you can obviously put Gaussian splats into certain things using certain plugins. You can also 3D print a mesh model that you can't 3D print a Gaussian splat. So if you're thinking about accessibility and people with, for example, visual problems with their vision, that they can touch and hold things, you can't necessarily do that.
I would argue though one thing, because one thing that I started realizing is that one of these capability of Gaussian splatting is, for example, of capturing objects that have high reflection. So let's imagine, for example, a car or a locomotive made of metal, a sword, right? Imagine so many of these that are reflecting metallic surfaces. When it comes to creating a mesh from photogrammetry, it's close to impossible. One is that when you turn a Gaussian splat into a mesh, so you do the meshing process on that Gaussian splatting that's being created, then you got a pretty decent mesh. Is that something that maybe can be of use, or have you seen that applying, or some people playing with this concept about Gaussian splatting as a way to create a better mesh than a photogrammetry model for specific objects that maybe are extremely hard to scan with photogrammetry?
I mean, I've obviously seen people non-heritage or people posting their experience in such workflows, but no, I haven't seen anyone using Gaussian splatting to then generate a mesh. I think when it comes to capturing something that's very shiny, maybe that sword, let's go with that idea. There are handheld laser scanners or structured light scanners that can be combined with a photogrammetry workflow that can also, there are many ways to do this, but I think to jump to Gaussian splatting to create the mesh, I think is a step too far, I think, for a technology that's so young. If you imagine, heritage organizations are pretty slow moving in general to adopt technologies, and they're only really getting their head around 3D meshes and laser scanning right now as the technologies are becoming more affordable and accessible. So it's early days still, I think, even though it's been, some 10 years.
I can imagine. And so you said an important thing, like capturing in 3D is kind of like a side business, right? That's not their core things. I felt what you mentioned. Now, how do you approach a conversation, for example, with a museum? How do you, I wouldn't call it pitch, but that show what this technology can do and package it in a format that is somehow interesting to this organization and solves a problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I say it's generally not 3D is generally not a core activity, but there are examples. The Smithsonian in the US has a great digitization program. One of my favorites comes from Poland, a group called Virtual Museums of Malopolska. They have a hub for digitization. They work with 40 small organizations to digitize. So there are examples of large scale digitization projects, but for lots of folks, as you say, they maybe they don't even, when you say, let's make some 3D, that phrase, I think for people who work in the space, you understand kind of what we're talking about. Maybe we can define like a Gaussian splat or a mesh. But for some people, they may be thinking, oh, that's a 360 video or image. They might think of Street View. They might think of virtual reality or XR, like straight away when we talk about 3D. They may even think of video games or visual effects. So I think getting people on the same page in the first place by showing examples of, this is what we're talking about, I think is one key element, is to explain what you're talking about. Make sure that there's a sympathy between you and the organization, the contact you have there. I think if you can find an ally for what you're trying to do, somebody who is enthusiastic, I think that's a big plus, because you can contact the wrong person at a big organization, get a negative reply if you're hoping to help them digitize. But if you find the right person who is enthusiastic, and this has been my experience many times, and then the more you can even wait for people to come to you if you work publicly on social media, tell people what you're doing. I think people can see what you're doing, and that actually happened through just a post on LinkedIn about AR that then somebody from the Ministry of Culture in Saudi Arabia saw, and then they approached me. So it's not so much about kind of like knocking on the door sometimes there is a need or a will from within. So that can help.
So one thing is, first of all, look for people that have already some sort of commitment or initiative where it might look like there is some 3D general awareness and maybe some initiatives and consequently budget to go along for part of this project. The other part is also like, what is usually the value to a museum in running this initiative, right? Because this is a technology that could solve many problems in a way. Can you share some example of like, okay, they wanted to do this digitization for this specific reason or for this reason, solving this problem? Is that something that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, from my personal work while I was at the British Museum, we digitized objects to 3D print handling objects. So handling tables are very common at museums. They have a real artifact that you can pick up and look at, and somebody tells you about it. One of my favorite things is, to hear from another human at a museum. And for some objects, you can't give them to the members of the public. So we 3D printed some so that people could engage with them. Also to, just use the 3D data to generate derivative 2D images or 2D video for use in exhibition collateral, so catalogs or for, on screens in the different galleries. That this is also common. And then the simple act of kind of, I suppose, outreach with your collections to show people, 3D is just another way to show people what you've got in your collection and to tell the story of an object or a subject. It could, 100 years ago it was drawings and then black and white photography, color photography. Now we have this new way to capture things and just show someone something, explain to them what it is at a distance. So going back to that idea, I think of managing expectations and finding a way into working with organizations, I think, is having a clear way of explaining all the different ways, because 3D is a very versatile medium, all the different ways that it could be helping people be educated using the collection, maybe make money for the organization. Maybe it's about promotion of the organization, a PR exercise. It depends very much, but to find the exact thing that gets the organization excited, I think is key to working with.
Exactly. And by the way, now you saying that when you say 3D print, I'm like, right. I was actually a few weeks ago in this Natural Science Museum in Leiden, and there was this huge T-Rex, and one of the employees came over and gave me this 3D printed blob of something. And I'm like, and she started explaining, so what is this? And I said, I don't know, maybe I don't know, it looks like an ovary to me. But actually it turns out it was the brain inside the T-Rex. So they kind of like reconstructed. And of course you can do all this only if you have some form of turning something into 3D data. Another example actually that I've seen is that part of the skeleton was actually reconstructed and 3D printed. So again, you need to use 3D technology to assemble. If there is anything else at any moment, let me know, because we can cut it, right? Okay. Just no problem. And now there is also one thing that actually come to mind always, where there is this, I don't know if it's a story or a legend, I do think it's true, that a lot of the artifacts that museums have is actually not shown to the public. It is in boxes, it is in storage somewhere, archives. Is this something, first of all, is this true? And second, is this something that could be potentially seen as value to the museum to start such a project?
Yeah, I think there are many sort of reasons why an organization would or would not begin a digitization project, and like staff time, funding, and having the technology, the resources to digitize is one. But to answer the question, yes, many and most organizations have, storage units with hundreds of thousands of objects that will never be put on display. And this is true for big and small organizations. There are, initiatives like here in the UK, there's a museum called the V&A, and they're recently opening up one of their storage facilities as a visiting center. So you can go to the storage space and tour. To be able to do that digitally is very common anyway. So 2D images of collections objects, this is highly common across many organizations that have a web presence. So we're just making a small step from we're going to 2D photograph in 2D to offer 3D, but there is a fairly large technology gap between the infrastructure organizations have for managing 2D images. It's very common for, every web browser to be able to display, very common for, the IT infrastructure at a heritage organization to be able to handle images. But for 3D, there's a few more steps to being able to kind of pop it on your website. And that's a trick that people are trying to figure out, whether they self-host, whether they use services, or, whether they build something custom. So yeah, there's all these kind of aspects. To go back to the original question, yes, I think it's a great possibility and use case, but it's a huge undertaking if you're thinking about mass digitization.
So you said, I think, a key word, that was web, in the sense that once you have these digital data, right? And I imagine in a form of a 3D model, whatever that might be, whatever that might look like. What happens next? What are the best practices, what you have seen, what maybe you would recommend people to investigate on? Because again, if we look back at that Gaussian splatting idea, that's the moment that the web becomes, for example, maybe more appealing solution than a mesh because of the visual fidelity, because of the weight that is decreasing to levels that are now like pretty remarkable, I would say. But again, I'm not the expert here, so I would like to hear from you to hear what happens to this 3D data, how they're shared, and if you see their Gaussian splatting having any sort of advantage or opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think publishing 3D data on the web was essentially the thing that got me excited about working with this in the first place. It was when I was at the British Museum working as a web designer. I discovered 123D Catch, a very old, is now obsolete piece of 3D photogrammetry software, and at the same time discovered Sketchfab. And so I'm working at this museum. There's a way to make 3D models, and there's an easy way to publish them. So that was kind of a easy connection for me and other people to make. So being able to kind of show people things in 3D as a baseline, this will be useful. I think it is where I kind of come from, and I'm still kind of excited about with and that's still an unsolved problem, as I kind of keep coming back to this idea of like it's actually tricky for people to maintain collections of 3D data, which can be huge data sets. From the process can generate gigabytes, terabytes of data for one 3D model, and organizations need to look after that data for the long term within their remit as a heritage organizations. With Gaussian splatting, again, there's all these benefits of there's platforms that allow you to annotate the data and create tours, or to walk around in a social environment with other users. There are interesting initiatives looking at segmenting data. So you have a 3D Gaussian splat of a gallery, and you can begin to segment the different subjects. All of these things are great, but rely on third-party technologies and services, generally speaking, to allow a heritage organization to reach their audience. So first they need to define who they're trying to reach, what they're trying to do with the data. And then, well, how can we do that? Can we do it ourselves, or do we have to rely on, Arrival Space or Supersplat or, another platform? And what does that mean? We're putting our data onto different services. Is that ethically okay for the subject? Is it legally okay in terms of, complying with the laws of a country? What will you do on that platform that could then be retrieved, in terms of data portability? Or will we get locked in to having to use this platform or this service? And this is a big issue. And the heritage community has kind of seen the changes at Sketchfab over the years with some concern. And in fact, I'll be undertaking some research specifically looking at the UK's infrastructure for 3D data, the heritage industries. infrastructure for heritage data in response to this, this need that people are producing data, huge amounts of data, but there's no, I suppose, reliable long-term way to, there's two kind of aspects: storing the data, these huge data sets for the long term, so people in 100 years, 200 years can access them. And then can they be used and exploited? Can they also be understood by a school child and interacted with, or, an age-old learner, that kind of thing? So there's many aspects and many needs to be met.
It's fascinating, also because I'm also thinking right now, when thinking about data, maybe we also think about the final output. And again, if you are thinking about that, it's not necessarily always just a model. Sometimes there is the texture file. Sometimes, for example, in the case of also generating that output, so there is a video or pictures that have been taken, right? So again, you need to manage that video. But for example, fun story, I was actually also involved in a kind of like, his preservation was about street art. And it was this huge wall that everybody knew was going to be demolished because the whole neighborhood was to be renovated. I went there, I scanned it using photogrammetry, and it turned out nice, but not great. I still had the video, and I was still able then to use Gaussian splatting instead to recreate that same environment. So that shows also how there is value in not only on preserving the object, but also the source that was used. And then you're talking also about protocols, because at that point, it's not just simply the fact of making that video, maybe having the information about what tools, what technology, hardware, how you did the scan. How do you solve this, Thomas? How do you maybe as maybe you can take both sides as a 3D scanning professional, something that is passionate, something maybe has a studio and is venturing into this project. How can he start understanding this level of complexity and maybe support these museums in understanding and moving steps, even though slowly, forward into this process?
I think you hit on a lot of pertinent questions there. For one thing, that there is guidance being proposed by different groups. The community standards for 3D preservation out of the US. There's some great academic publications coming out of the University of Technology in Cyprus, the UNESCO chair on digital cultural heritage, and the partners there providing guidance on things you should do when you're, even before you begin, how to plan, how to think about what you're doing before you do it. Because I think a lot of 3D data has been captured, and this is true for the work that I did at the British Museum, kind of on a whim and as an experiment, which is good. It's fine. It is what it is. But ideally, you would, as you say, you would kind of be thinking about all the data. I read recently a phrase that sums it up really, like the data liability. So obviously, there's an opportunity with capturing lots of data, but then you have the liability of looking after it in the long term. The input data, the project files, maybe that you're processing. Maybe producing some kind of master archive file that maybe includes all of those things, and then some kind of working file that researchers and academics can use, and then derivative files that more regular users may use, or creatives may use. So there's all this data. There's more and more data, and you need to kind of look after it. There's, as I say, guidance out there. It's a tricky, situation to navigate, I think, and it requires a lot of resources which a lot of heritage organizations don't have, because they're small, they're underfunded, and they have other priorities.
So now, if people are listening up to here, they're probably going to give up, but I still want to give them hope, in a sense that so the idea is, sometimes, as you said a very, very interesting point. I did this thing with the British Museum on a whim. Right. And you don't do things on a whim with the British Museum normally, in a sense. So the idea is, what is there, I wouldn't call it a hack, but an advice to start what looks like maybe like a pilot project? Because that's also where things start sometimes, right? Maybe we have a little bit of budget to do some tests on something small. What are some advice that you could give to people either from the museum, maybe curators or who is involved in this project to pitch this internally, and either to the people that are outside and could provide the service to start something of like small, contained, that could really help them test the water. And because when you are in a hall and at some point kids start playing out with 3D printed parts of that model, that could bring engagement, that could bring like a visitor experience that is certainly improved than having something that is static and inside a glass box, right? Mm-hmm. So what advice could you give to kickstart something simple from both sides?
Well, I think in a sense, you've just kind of demonstrated one great way to start is to define the audience and the use case at the beginning. What are we trying to do? Who are we trying to reach? And from there, define the tools and the technologies that you will employ to reach that goal. And you may find that 3D is one of those technologies that enables you to do something. So that's I think a really good point to begin from. And then from there, you can then plan the process and figure out what subjects you will digitize and what you will do with them. I think agreeing on the value that you are generating between yourselves, if it's a collaboration that doesn't involve any money changing hands. So an organization says, I'll come and scan for free and we'll give you the data. I think defining, okay, well, exactly what does this mean? What will the deliverables be? And what will the legal agreements be? What will the licensing be around the data to kind of lay a foundation for the wonderful creative stuff that you're hoping to do? Because, I've been involved in projects that kind of grind to a halt because agreements weren't made previously in terms of what will happen when, how it will happen, who gets to use the data. So I think doing all the boring stuff, a risk assessment, of the space, a site visit, is super important. And then you can, the technology, the scanning part is almost a solved issue. The technology is there. We can make great 3D models in all kinds of different ways, and then we can display them in all kinds of different ways. So that's great. And so I suppose there's the hope is that it's almost anything is possible, but there are these foundational issues that need to be addressed. And this does go back to, one thing when I was reading through sort of some of the questions you sent through is that funding is such a huge issue for the heritage sector just within the last 5 years. I'd say, hundreds of museums within the UK, within the US have closed. And these all have huge collections that will, what will happen to these collections? We don't know. That, there's no chance of digitizing them in some sense. So there's an urgency, there's a problem, but at the same time, there's just a real, as you say, a big will within the technology community to apply the technology to this worthy cause.
I want to go back a second to one thing that I think we have explored enough, and that was the web, right? So you mentioned and dropped some names, like, for example, Arrival Space being, let's say, a platform where you can drop stuff, play Canvas and Super Splat. Like web-based, where you can have an iframe that you can embed on your website. Maybe what are ways in which these digital assets can be shared online? So I do, by the way, encourage everybody listening to think again about the fact that, hey, you can scan this, 3D print it, or use it for your collateral material, for videos, for 3D renders. I think it is very powerful and maybe something that people don't think about because, again, that could be a very powerful use with business impact as well, right? But what about something that you want to show on the web? What are the, let's say, best, most reliable ways that you have seen, maybe keeping in mind some of those obstacles that people encounter along the road when let's say, striking these partnerships?
Well, I will plug the AAAF 3D community group, of which I am a co-chair to begin with. So AAAF stands for International Image Interoperability Framework. So essentially, this is a way that organizations can publish data online that will make it available to people who want to present it in different ways. So you publish a 3D model, the metadata, everything about that subject, everything about the files, the paradata as well. How was it made, as you were saying earlier? What is this data I'm looking at? So that people can kind of plug it into different platforms, different ways of showing it. So that's a group that's been working on this concept for a long time. Recommend if you're interested, join the group. It's free. Come and say hello. But going back to kind of, I have a 3D model. Where do I put it? It's a good question. You could use an open source viewer, the Smithsonian Voyager viewer, or the X3D format, or you could use 3D Hop. Is another quite old 3D viewer that is heritage specific. These are self-hosted, so you'd have to know how to code a web page and set something up. So they're a bit tricky, but people are creating these kind of platforms. Then there's the kind of, I suppose, more general 3D platforms. So things like Arrival Space and Supersplat and Sketchfab. And they are really great because there's already an audience there who are engaging with 3D data. And as a human, most people are kind of interested in history and culture anyway, art, all the things that the heritage sector is preserving and taking care of. So I think ideally the best place to be with your 3D data is everywhere. But practically you need to kind of pick and choose depending. Sketchfab is a wonderful platform. I've got a special place for Sketchfab in my heart, having worked there. Great team, great product. But it's not where you put your data for long-term sustainable access. And because it's essentially one of the only places you can put your data, it has become the de facto for a lot of organizations. So there's a chance to take stock and decide, okay, we use a platform for this, to do this, we use another platform to achieve these other goals.
So can you elaborate on that? Because I can already hear some people like, what? I cannot put my stuff on Sketchfab. Why I cannot do it? And I could understand their concern. Can you maybe elaborate on that? Like, what are the implications? Maybe what are the alternatives?
So I should say that I'm not saying do not put your stuff on Sketchfab. I'm saying that there's kind of a layer cake. I've been doing a few presentations recently about, you have high quality archival data sets that you either save locally or, on magnetic tape, you put them in long-term storage. Above that, you have interoperable libraries of data that are derivative file formats. Maybe they're, you start with, I don't know, OBJs at the archival level or PLYs or X3D format. And then as you start to publish data, you are using GLBs, USD, modern file formats. And then these can then power these like exciting, engaging, fun experiences that, reach audiences. But I think ideally you have the layer cake that starts at the bottom and then goes up. So the top cake, the top part of the cake, that's where Sketchfab lies, and other platforms, whether it's Arrival Space or Supersplat. That's where your data can then travel on to different audiences. But you have backing that up, all of the data safely, securely stored somewhere, somehow, and you can't go backwards. You can't just kind of put it out and then hope that that's going to be the solution to the bottom layer.
So what I was thinking was also, now how there is another layer on top of the 3D file capture, mesh, textures, look. There is the whole history, in a sense, about that specific object or artifact or place. How does that work? Like, I mean, is there a way to, for example, keep telling a story and being sure that more than just the appearance of something is preserved?
Yeah, very much so. There's a concept that's kind of gaining traction within the heritage community, which is a memory twin. So maybe you've heard of digital twin. So you're capturing something in 3D and there's a digital copy. And even that is a vague term in terms of, is it dynamic? Does it change over time? But a memory twin encompasses the concept of capturing the connections of a space or a subject and having that as a not necessarily a data package, but as a holistic record of something. simply speaking, going back to that concept of metadata, every time you capture something, there will be an object record. What is this? What is it made of? Where does it come from? And it's tricky to, when you send your data out into the world to reach audiences, to keep them together. So that context may be relevant to some people, but it may not be to others. Somebody maybe just think this is a beautiful thing and I enjoy it for that. But other people, you want to be able to give people who want to dive deeper a way to witness the connections with that subject within a museum collection, between other collections, with stories, places, the history of the world, putting it into context. This is very, very important. And that's a much more valuable, in my opinion, a valuable thing than we have a 3D model. Who knows what it is, but it looks cool.
And so when it's about sharing this, right, with the right audience, are there ways to couple? Because when you enter a museum, there is a plate with things that tells you some context around it. I don't know, it's basic, but I think it still adds value. Sometimes there are brochures when you walk in, right, where you can check and there are audio guides, right? What about 3D? After it's being captured, are we relying on when it's published, we have a description of the object? Are there other ways? Because again, 3D has these immersive elements, right? And it feels like it's real, even though you're not there physically in the same place. So how do you tackle the challenge when you're dealing with a different type of data or different type of experience as well?
Yeah. Well, I think you kind of point out exactly the issue in some ways is that different experiences or platforms will have, say, that description. It could be a text box on one platform. Maybe it's an audio description on another. Maybe you're in a VR experience. So, reading a plaque is not as easy as in real life. But the idea, I think, is there's the concept of persistent identifiers or digital object identifiers within the heritage sector. So this is kind of the canonical record of a particular thing. And so to be able to plug that data, as well as the 3D model or the scene, the splat, whatever it is, to be able to kind of plug that in to whatever the platform is, and it would read, a simple description, longer description, all the tags, the categorization, to be able to surface that data is the ideal. But again, that doesn't even work always for 2D online collections as well as 3D. But that would be the ideal, is that there would be an authoritative record somewhere that then powers all these other experiences. And, it would make it easy for people to pull out, or delve deeper and find out.
You brought it up, so I need to ask VR, right? The picture that you depicted is a bit like, it's tough, it's complicated. But I do believe that there are still success stories around having these pieces, these places preserved and shared in an immersive way. Now we're talking about VR, that could be fully immersive. I'm even talking about something that has with a phone, right? That maybe gets more accessible to people, that adds a digital layer of information, maybe recognized object. Are there some example that you could share where, let's say, XR was, let's say, implemented and has been used successfully in your, let's say, past experience?
Oh, and just to clarify, I think all I was bashing in VR is when you have a text panel that you kind of you can't read. VR is in general, I think is a great experience. I've got a Quest 3 myself. I've had loads of great experiences with cultural content. I love the concept of web VR or web XR, that you can just reach a library of experiences via the web, not necessarily downloading something, but there are some really nice demos online. There's a really old demo from Mozilla, actually, which is kind of a playground, but they have a painting that you can look at with a magnifying glass. And this is a really fun, interactive way to engage with a subject. And I think that there's a gap of knowledge of like, what's actually fun? What are we adding with this technology? So that's definitely a consideration. What I like is the idea that VR can transport you somewhere. So either you're at home and you are going somewhere that you will maybe never go to. And, there are plenty of 3D in the sense of meshes and Gaussian splats. There are plenty of travel VR experiences where you can go on a tour and using 360 video, etc. And they're pretty great as well. But I also like the idea of for heritage organizations, it can be a question, or I've rather seen it implemented more often as an attraction. So you go to the museum and there is a VR experience while you're there. And I think that makes so much sense, because for a lot of museums, they want people to visit. They want, that's how they generate revenue and how they will be in existence in, the next 100 years. There's a great project out of Catalonia in Spain called Giravolt, who have produced a kind of a traveling VR exhibition that they take to schools, and it travels around. So you're taking it to people, because not everyone has, as contrary to tech people that we may believe everyone has a VR headset, not everybody does. So this idea of giving people the opportunity by taking the experience to them, I think is also very, very powerful. I know that, so I haven't really talked about specific experiences, but that's how I, feel about VR. Is it's great to transport people to different places. And again, you just have to just understand what are we bringing to the experience. Sometimes I get a bit technophobic about, are we putting a phone between us and the artwork? There's a consideration. Do we need to look at our phone at the same time as, I love going to a museum to look at the things, but when I'm at home, I can't look at the things. So a screen is the next best thing. But, is it helping or is it getting in the way is worth a question worth asking.
Are there some topics that comes to mind? I mean, some experiences that you would suggest that people should try in VR on a headset?
Yeah, I actually keep a list. So if you give me 1 second, I will look it up. One is that Mozilla XR demo, and I know it's not heritage specific, but it is a good one. If I can't find the links, hopefully I can share them with you after. But there's also an experience from a German art gallery that it's kind of a dreamy white wall gallery to begin with, but as you can zip around and then you can step into the painting. And take a selfie within the painting, and it's kind of silly, but it's also kind of clever in what it's sort of arranged. There are some experiences on the Quest that I've tried that let you, for example, shrink down and walk around what is an architectural model. So playing with that's something that you really only can do in VR. I love that idea of playing with people. I have a kind of a problem when virtual galleries end up being exactly the same as a regular gallery. It's like, let's put you in a room. You can't touch the things. You have to walk around. I want to be doing fantastical things. I want to be doing things that I can't. I want to be able, just being able to pick something up and turn it over, I think is a great affordance of VR and digitisation. I think giving people an extra experience as opposed to making them kind of do regular life stuff in VR.
Exactly. And there is that layer of gamification, augmentation, that you then can be discussed and implemented in many different ways. But if I'm walking in a museum, maybe not worth it to rebuild it from scratch. And I think it's also, you made a good point when saying maybe if you think about it as an attraction, that's the moment that you think about ways in which this can actually generate value, fit within the storytelling of the venue, the hall, or the maybe, and also generate kind of recurrent revenue in a sense. I mean, that experience could change, could be adapted, and it's not that easy to change I imagine, the layout of a hall of a museum. One is that you can much easier change actually digital content. Thomas, I do have one last thought here, because while during our conversation, you have been mentioning a couple of times photos and videos, and I think we are in a moment where people can create 3D models as easy as taking a picture. Maybe it takes 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes, but there are people that are scanning literally the world. And I'm being pretty literal here. What are the implications for that? In a moment where we are looking back at World War II or maybe even older picture to actually reconstruct our history, right? What about this huge pool of data and connected at different times, more or less reliably? How will 3D impact the way in which we tell history?
I think it's going to be a huge benefit and a huge problem at the same time for future humans to kind of delve into, not just 3D, but all the data being produced and published online now. And I think it will always come with the context of why it's being put online. What is the motivation for the person capturing something in 3D and publishing it? What have they called it? How have they described it? I love every platform for user generated content. So that offers 3D. So whether that's Scaniverse, and they have their map, and Niantic Labs has this kind of goal to digitize the world and create a kind of digital twin, or if it's Polycam, where there's a social element of publishing things. People always seem to gravitate towards digitizing cultural things that they are near. So it's very common, and some of these will be the only 3D model at this time that has been captured, and it's not by a professional, and it's not using high-grade equipment. But this question is that going to be the only data available in terms of 3D data, maybe, of a subject? And it's going to be tricky for people to understand. Add to that generative AI that, now 3D models are as easy to, more easy than capturing a photo. You can just type in and say, give me a 3D model. How is that data being flagged, labeled, managed? How will that intermingle with all the data that's being produced? It's going to be complicated in the future. And then layer on that, again, the stories, why people are doing things. It's going to be tricky to know what's, kind of a propaganda, what is truth, what is made up.
I mean, also when you were saying part of it, I mean, right now you can take a picture and generate a 3D model from that picture. So, of course, the AI hallucinates or come up with the back of that thing. You never know what the back of that thing looks like, right? So, I mean, indeed, the implications are just huge. Maybe just curious, is there anybody thinking about this, like actively, and not just thinking, but say, okay, what are we going to do about it? Either all these 3D data and as well some of these AI-generated information.
Sure. Well, I can say I have been thinking about it. So I wrote an article for my newsletter a while ago that I think was fairly well received within the heritage community. Just flagging that, it was in response to Meta announcing their latest generative 3D model. So they have a generative 3D model for populating their metaverse project. You need things to put into your metaverse, and they advertised it with quasi-cultural subjects. So it's kind of a pharaoh's head, almost an Easter Island statue, but they weren't, historically accurate in any way. And at the same time, you have real 3D data from real heritage organizations that of those subjects, that is instant competing within the attention economy for space in these platforms, and whether they're managed by different big corporations. So I didn't really kind of come up with a solution, but just to flag, this is going to continue to be an issue. I was recently at Belfast University just last week for a symposium on AI and visual and textual analysis, where I presented some of these ways that AI is seeping into the digitization process. So AI is assisted photogrammetry. What is it doing? What is it adding, like you say? But also, positive things like AI assisted experience creation. So helping people who are non-technical experts, non-coders, non-developers to build experiences to tell their stories using this content, I think is very, very positive. So there's positives and negatives. And I think it's just about keeping an eye on things and asserting the authority of knowledge. I mean, so I'm talking about heritage organizations being able to tell, this is the real thing. We digitize this at this date. This is from here. We have the records. I think it's great. But even that you can question and say, well, is that just a Western perspective? Is this, the real colonial telling of this particular story? So it's so complicated. It's amazing and terrifying.
Thomas, thank you very much. If there is one thing that I took away is that you need to follow Thomas on the at least Spatial Heritage Review, because there is a lot of things a lot of information and in-depth studies that you need to check. And Thomas, you opened a world for me. I'm not going to look at 3D in the same way today.
Oh, I'm very, very glad to hear that. And thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure. I could talk for hours even more, but I appreciate we have to stop sometime.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you very much for listening in. If you like the show, remember to leave a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or a thumbs up on YouTube. It really helps me keep doing this and shine the spotlights on the greatest founders and makers, pushing the boundaries of XR and AI. Also, make sure to check out the show page xraispotlight.com, where you can find more conversation like this one. Till next time.